I read it and then forgot about it, then wrote my book, and I reread it recently, and I realized so many things maybe I haven't stolen from it, but it's in conversation with that book. Hi, my name is Luke Horton. My novel is Time Together, and it comes out with Scribe this month. Time Together is a book about a group of old friends who, in their 40s, who are coming back together to spend a week-long holiday together on the beach. And they're coming to stay at one of the main characters' house. His name is Phil, and he has just recently lost his mother. So he's grief-stricken, and he is thinking that maybe inviting a group of old friends to his house is going to help with that. They used to come and stay at this house when they're in their 20s, so it's been a while. He's seen them a bit since then, but not so much. It's a book that's told from 4 different points of view, 2 women and 2 men, over this long week, a beach holiday. And it's about, I guess, the fraught nature of these long-term friendships, these long-term relationships. Some of them have partners and children, and some of them don't. And I guess it's about grief and parenting, and also a little bit about, having nice holidays on, the unceded lands of Indigenous people, and how that comes into the holiday. But it's really at heart, I guess, about this yearning for connection and for community, and how hard that can be to achieve, and how hard it can be to try and love people that you don't always necessarily like. My first book, The Fogging, was set mostly in Indonesia, in Bali, and it was about this kind of anxious academic in his 30s who went on his first ever holiday to Bali, and his sort of uncomfortable relationship with the kind of colonial fantasies that people have when they're on a holiday like that, being waited on by the local people and having all this money and these luxury resorts. And so, that context of sort of Western tourism, how fraught and how difficult that is, and how you want to enjoy the culture and enjoy the beautiful holiday, but how these relationships and tensions can be in there. And that was sort of something I was exploring in that first book. And then, so this new book, one answer to that question is that I wanted to write a book about Australia, write a book in a really landscape that I know really well, which is New South Wales South Coast, beautiful headlands and lagoons and beaches and national park. And so I wanted to write about that natural landscape. But yes, and the way that we interact with that sense of place and with that landscape for our holidays, without really knowing, or sometimes having a little bit of knowledge about the kind of violent colonial history of that and how that comes into our experience with place and our holidays. And I don't want to overstate that, because that ends up being, in the background of the book rather than a sort of major feature of it. But that was sort of the starting point in a way. It was like, I want to write about that place. I want to write about Australia. I want to write about that issue, perhaps. And then I started thinking, well, who would be there? And one was like, well, I lost my mother, so about 6 or 7 years ago. And so I knew the book was going to be about grief in some way. And so Phil, sitting in this family home, grief-stricken, still after 6 months, going back to the family home, in fact, just to feel closer to her. And then who would he invite up, and who might he invite up, and then what might they bring to this holiday? That was sort of the starting point of it. Yeah. The easy answer is my daughter is 8. So parenting and children have been very much on my mind and in my life, sort of, and such a radical shift, and I was kind of, quite late to having a child. And so it's such a radical shift in your life to all of a sudden be caring for somebody else like this. Your life is sort of overtaken by being a parent and having this child that you're looking after, and all of a sudden you're just spending all your time with other children and other kids and parents who you don't know necessarily through school and daycare and all of that. So you write what's around you, so in some ways I certainly didn't think I want to write children or anything, but it's just what's been in my life. So I guess they've come into it. But then, as you say, yeah, there's a few of them. And I really enjoy that, and in a way, I don't have a 12-year-old, which is Millie, and she's probably the most important child in the book, because she's the most, she affects the plot the most, I guess. Her bad mood and her not talking to her mother is kind of what propels the plot along, and her kind of increasingly bad behavior is what propels the plot, the story along. And so that was a bit of a challenge. Like, I don't have a 12-year-old. So how to write her was an interesting challenge. But there are older cousins and things like that in our lives, which are, I have drawn on a little bit around that. And also writing from women's point of view. Like in the first book, it was all very intensely from one man's point of view. And that's quite claustrophobic and intense, and he's very in his own head. And I wanted to try some new things. So none of the children have their point of view in time together, but two women do, and the kids are quite major. And I really wanted to play with those intergenerational dynamics, of children and parents, and children and friends of parents, and how all that plays out. Was an interesting dynamic and fun thing to write about. No, I'm not a full-time writer. I don't know many writers who are. Most writers now have to have day jobs. So we write around our jobs, and that can make things difficult. But if you really want to do it, you find time for it, And so I have kind of made my life around those ambitions to write novels. And so I teach, creative writing at RMIT, and I teach creative writing at the Faber Academy. And I love both of those jobs. And that just gives me enough time to dedicate some of my week to getting writing done as well. I can write anywhere and any time. I had a very young daughter when I was finishing my first book. And I probably had less time than I'd ever had. Sometimes when it's pressured time, you actually get more done. And I think that was the case then. It's like I had these little snatches of time, but I knew what I was already working on the book, so that helped. I wasn't staring at a blank page. I was in the middle of a book. So I could keep doing it around the very intense first couple of years of parenting. My semesters change every semester. My classes change, my times change. So it's never the same thing. I'm certainly not a get up at 5 o'clock and write for an hour or two before work type person. I find I have a couple of afternoons a week or something like that where I can squeeze it in. And that's what I talk to my students about all the time. Like, we all have busy lives. We all work. No one has lives where they can just sit around and write. So it's about making that work. Is it about taking notes on your phone when you can? So then when you do have a bit of time to write, you're not staring at a blank page, you've got something to work off. And those things can trick you into writing. You can all of a sudden think, I'm just taking a note about something, but then you write a page, even on a phone, on public transport. So there's lots of different ways of getting a book written. And for a while during that time, I didn't have a dedicated space. I was just on the kitchen table. I've had periods where I've had a nice little office. But I can get it done sort of anytime and anywhere if I'm really in a book and really, really want to. Are there any literary characters that have stuck in your mind? Yeah, well, often, you can talk about a book, like your new book, in so many different ways. And one of the ways I could talk about my new book is the way it's in conversation with other books. It could be, we've talked about, things in my life that I drew on for writing this book. But as much as those things, you're drawing on your reading when you're writing. And so there's books that are really key to the writing of this book that meant a lot to me when I was writing. And one of those is Roland Barthes' The Morning Diary, and mourning as in grief, mourning not as in part of the day. And he wrote that after his mother passed away, and he kept a journal, a diary of every day he would write something about his experience of grief. And It's a beautiful book, often very short little passages, little fragments, little reflections on how he is feeling and how the grief is changing over time. And that book meant a lot to me when I was grieving, and looking to writing to help me through that. But also became a kind of book I'd go back to when I was writing the character of Phil and his grief. There's a great entry at some point where he says something just like, after 8 months, a second grief. And it's like it comes in waves and it comes back. And that's kind of where Phil is in the book. He's been 6 or 7 months, but he's still swamped by it, or swamped again by it. So there's one. That's not really a literary character, but it's more of a book. I guess the character is himself and his mother. This great bond between him and his mother, and the way he talks about her is so touching and beautiful, and how serious he takes it, and just the attention to it, and to write through that pain, which is something I had no compulsion to do when I was really grief-stricken. But it's come out in my fiction a little bit later. So the other really important book to this book is, well, Virginia Woolf, a few of her books, in fact. To the Lighthouse became an important book. So the Ramsays, both Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, are both really important in some ways. I read it and then forgot about it, then wrote my book, and I reread it recently, and I realized so many things maybe I haven't stolen from it, but it's in conversation with that book. Like, there's lots of things, like there's group dynamics of a whole group of people sitting around having dinners together. There's lots of interactions with children. There's lots of thoughts about making art, which is an important part of my book too. There's a couple of people in their 40s thinking about making art again, and how depressing and exhausting and overwhelming that can feel to do in your 40s, to start making art. And Lily Briscoe in Into the Lighthouse is one of those characters struggling to make art. So I realized on rereading how much I was in conversation with that book. The role of writers in writing in 2025. That's a fascinating question. And it's one I've been thinking about a lot, to do with my own writing and my own activism, and about how useful writing literary fiction is, and is it helping things that I would like to be helping? Is it a good use of my time? All of those kind of questions. In some ways, those answers are just all questions are all answered by my compulsion to do it, right? Which I try not to overthink. Is that I sort of feel like I need to be writing. It feels like what I should be doing. So I've been writing actually this this political essay that's proliferating and become this crazy mess. But it's been about how my book would be a very different book, I think, if it was written, after October 7 in 2023, because it was sort of written in the main before that. It just takes so long to edit and publish and everything, that even the characters in the book would be having different kinds of conversations if it happened after the unfolding genocide in Gaza. And, what a huge and traumatic and horrifying thing that has been to witness over the last 18 months, to see this live screened kind of genocide unfolding on our phones, and then the kind of non-response to that by Western governments and the media and everything. I do think that writers have a responsibility to use their voice and to be political, because there's no avoiding politics. There's no neutrality. To be neutral or to be silent about issues like genocide is not a neutral position. It's an ideological position that supports the status quo and supports our complicity, the complicity of our government. So I would like to see more writers take that role more seriously. Well, I read a lot of different things. I guess I read a lot of literary fiction, like my own writing. I'm reading more nonfiction now than I have for a long time. That might be because I'm between books myself. I've been, reading great books on the history of the Middle East and Palestine and things like that, which have been great, which really helps you get beyond the limited things you can learn from like Instagram reels and things like that. Like, I feel like I want to learn more about the history of all of that. What else? So I've been reading Palestinian writers. I've been reading Isabella Hamad, who's written a great novel called Enter Ghost, which is about an English Palestinian woman, or a Palestinian woman living in England, who goes back to Palestine. It's set before October 7, but it's all about her re-engagement with her past and her heritage, and also recommitment to political struggle. It's a really beautiful novel. And she wrote a non-fiction book, a little slim little book, which was actually based on a speech that she gave called Recognizing the Stranger, which is all about her sort of political response to the genocide in Gaza. And I've been really enjoying reading works like that. Otherwise, I read just a lot of literary fiction. I guess I've been going through a sort of modernist phase with Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence, and reading a lot of writers like that, and reading some of those books of theirs that I hadn't read before. They've become important writers to me. And then I try and sneak in contemporary literary fiction in there as well. I grew up in bookshops. So my parents ran bookshops in the countryside in the Bega Valley. They had a bookshop, and I grew up in that bookshop. So I was reading from a young age, and reading widely. And, I came as a teenager, like we all do, especially young boys go through their kind of beat poet phase and all of that. But I was doing that quite young. And so a lot of those books, like the Jack Kerouac books, and then all the existential books, the Camus and the Kafka and Sartre, and all those classic teenage angst books that people read, Salinger, all of those books were my favorite books when I was, I don't know, 13, 14, 15. And they were the books that made me get excited by, just being able to write about your life and about the weirdness of being alive and all of that. But I didn't take my writing seriously until I was much, much older. In the end, the kind of books that made me think like I could do it was often actually contemporary literary fiction that was, say, about Australia as well. Like writers like Helen Garner, obviously no one can write like Helen Garner. So deceptively simple and beautiful. And yet when you read books like that about Melbourne and just about their experiences, like Monkey Grip, about this experience of living in share houses in inner city Melbourne, and the trials and tensions of living in share houses and having kids, and in Melbourne in the 70s, reading those kinds of books and realizing, that you can write about things you are going through. And, maybe there's your version of those experiences that could be written about. Those books, yeah, were probably important to me as well. I've got 2 new manuscripts that I'm working on, and I'm a bit torn about which book I am following. Very different ones as well. So that's kind of interesting, but I'm in a kind of no pressure moment, which is nice. I can kind of explore ideas and say, this week I'm going to be working on this, but it doesn't have to turn into anything. I've been writing some nonfiction. But yeah, I've got a couple of different manuscripts on the go, and I'm not sure which one is going to be a book, and maybe neither. Maybe I'll put them both aside and some other idea will hit me. But I'm having fun at the moment, just being kind of loose and free and just writing whatever comes to me rather than thinking this is the next book. Thank you so much for having me. It was great.